Lesson 77, Fraction and Decimal Word Problems. First, we'll continue with something that we started last time, consecutive integers and problems dealing with these. Today we'll talk about when we have consecutive odd or consecutive even integers. Now with these, if we look at the number line, we can see that, for example, 1, the next odd integer is 3 after that. That's 2 greater than it. And after that will be 5. And then 7. So we have an increase of 2 units each time instead of 1, because it's not the next integer, but rather the next odd integer. And the same thing if we have even integers starting with 2, we go up 2 units to 4, 2 more units to 6, and so on. This goes for negative units also. We can start at -9. The next consecutive odd integer will be -7, which is 2 units greater. So when we're setting up one of these problems, we'll use n for that first one. The second one will be n plus 2. The third one will be n plus 4, and so on. Remember, when you're checking your work for these problems, they've told you whether your answers are even or odd, so make sure that when you give those answers that in fact they are even or odd, as the problem has indicated. Let's do some examples. Find 3 consecutive odd integers such that the sum of the first and the third is 7 greater than the second decreased by 18. So for our integers here, because they're consecutive odd integers, the first one will be n, the next one will be n plus 2, and the one after that will be n plus 4. Now when we're setting up the problem, let's make sure that we're reading it carefully here. The sum of the first and the third, so that's n plus 4, the first is n, then n plus 4, is 7 greater than the second decreased by 18. So it's 7 greater than what? The second decreased by 18. The second is n plus 2 decreased by 18 minus 18. Now notice here I've used parentheses for these other integers here, and it's very important to do that. For this particular problem it's not going to matter, but we'll see in the next one it does. So the first one is n plus 4 is the third one, so we've got the sum of them there. And then here the second decreased by 18, n plus 2, that's the second there, in parentheses again, decreased by 18, and we want 7 greater than that. So now once we've got this set up, in fact, we've got all addition here, and here we've also got all addition here, if we think this is adding 18. And so the order isn't going to matter. We can drop those parentheses and just get n plus 4 equals 7 plus n plus 2 minus 18. If we combine our like terms, we end up on the left 2n plus 4, and on the right n plus 7 plus 2 minus 18 gives us minus 9. We move the n's to the left by subtracting n from each side, and move the constants to the right by subtracting 4 from each side, and we get n is equal to -13. Remember, this isn't our answer by itself. We're looking for 3 odd integers, so -13, -11, and -9. And notice that these 3 integers are in fact odd, like the problem asked. Now let's check our work to make sure. So by plugging in these numbers, the sum of the first and the third, -13 plus -9, equals 7 greater than the second, -11, decreased by 18. And we get -22 is equal to -22. That checks out. Next example. Find 4 consecutive odd integers such that the sum of the first and fourth is 25 greater than the opposite of the third. So here our integers, will represent them using n, n plus 2, n plus 4, and n plus 6, with an increase of 2 each time. Now the first and the fourth, that's n and n plus 6, the sum of those is 25 greater than the opposite of the third. Now the opposite, remember, is if we have a positive number, its opposite is negative. If we have a negative number, its opposite is positive. And so we can write that using just a negative sign, because that'll take a positive number and make it negative, or also it'll take a negative number and make it positive. Now notice here, again, I've put the values for these other integers besides n inside parentheses to make sure that these numbers being added on stick with them. And that's very important here when we have negative n plus 4, as we'll see. So on the left here, these parentheses don't matter because it's just addition. So we can write that simply as n plus 6. On the right, however, this negative sign here means times -1. And since it's outside these parentheses, we're going to have to distribute it to both terms in there. So it isn't negative n plus 4, it's rather negative n plus -4, or minus n minus 4. So on the right, we have 25 minus n minus 4 because that negative from opposite of the third got distributed to both of the terms in there. Combine like terms, we get 2n plus 6 on the left, and 21 minus n on the right. Move the variables to the left by adding n to each side, and we move the constants to the right by subtracting 6 from each side. We get 3n is 15, divide by 3, n is 5. So our four integers are 5, 7, 9, and 11. Now let's check our work. So the first and the fourth, that's 5 plus 11, is 25 greater than the opposite of the third. The third is 9, so its opposite is negative 9. And 16 is equal to 16, so that checks out. Now, word problems involving fractions and decimals. We've seen problems like this before, things like 75 is 3/4 of what number, for example. But here we're going to be setting them in the context of real-world situations in word problems. A couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, of is going to indicate multiplication. And also, please, with these ones, make sure that your answer makes sense in the context of the problem. I've seen some issues with these in the last couple of tests and quizzes where guys are giving me answers that are way off from what they should be. Let's look at an example. Jack guessed that the total was 30.24, but this was 7.2 times the total. What was the total? Now, when we look at this problem, we should keep in mind the following things. Our answer should be much smaller than 30.24 because we know that 30.24 is 7.2 times the total. So we're looking for something that's about a seventh the size of this. So it should be much smaller than that. If you get something larger than 30.24 or close to that, that should be an indication to you that you've made a mistake somewhere and you need to go back and fix that. So 7.2 times the total, we'll use t for total here, so 7.2t is 30.24. Then we get that variable by itself by dividing by 7.2 on each side, and we get 4.2 there. And 4.2, that checks out. That's about a seventh the size of this. Right? If we took 4 and we multiplied by 7, we'd get 28, and that's pretty close there. So we've got about a seventh of that. That number makes sense as an answer. Whereas if you do things the wrong way around and you end up with an answer of 210, for example, that doesn't make sense because the number that he guessed was larger than the total. Another example. 3/4 of the tickets had been sold and there were 420 tickets left. How many tickets were printed? So again, note here the situation. 420 is the number of tickets that haven't been sold. They say 3/4 here have been sold, but the number that they give us is of the tickets that haven't been sold. So our answer should be larger than 420. So if 3/4 of the tickets have been sold, there will be 1/4 of them left. And if 1/4 of them is 420, we should end up with some original number that's larger. If you end up with a number that's close to 420 or smaller than 420, that doesn't make sense because how could there be more tickets left than there were printed? So we've got 1/4 of the tickets left. So 1/4 of multiplication, the tickets, t, is 420 tickets. To get that variable by itself, we can either divide by 1/4 on each side or just multiply by 4. Quarter t times 4 equals 420 times 4. Our total is 1680. And that makes sense because that's about 4 times. In fact, it's exactly 4 times 420, which we said was 1/4 of the tickets. All right, I hope you guys are watching these videos. I hope you're benefiting from them. If you are listening to this, I'll give you a heads up that the next video, I'm going to include in there an opportunity for some extra credit on our test on Thursday. So a bit of an incentive there to actually watch the video and follow through doing these problems.